pessoal, boa tarde, bom dia aí no Brasil. Meu nome é Jamil Chade para mais um episódio do Cruzando Fronteiras aqui no canal MyNews. Hoje nós temos a honra de receber o professor Steven Levitsky, professor da Universidade de Harvard, uma referência basicamente em todos os estudos que nós temos, inclusive na América Latina, sobre a questão do autoritarismo, da democracia. Em 2018, Levitsky publicou How Democracies Die, Como Morrem as Democracias, e claro, como professor ao lado, no fundo, do professor também de Harvard, Daniel Ziblatt. Ele é um profundo conhecedor da América Latina, é um autor de dezenas de estudos e de artigos publicados em alguns dos principais jornais do mundo, e hoje nós vamos conversar justamente sobre a democracia, sobre regimes autoritários na América Latina e, claro, sobre a situação brasileira. Professor Levitsky, very nice to have you here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, I'm going to be very straightforward with you and ask a very straightforward question that basically many people are asking in Brazil. Is democracy under threat in Brazil today?
Yes, I think it is. Any time in a presidential democracy like Brazil's, like the United States, where you elect to the presidency, which is a very powerful office, anytime you elect a president who is not committed to democratic rules of the game, you're putting your democracy at risk. We saw that in the United States, which has a very, very strong democratic institutions, has been a constitutional republic for more than 2 centuries. Despite that, despite the strength of America's democratic institutions, Donald Trump nearly carried out a presidential self-coup in 2020 and early 2021. He made a serious effort to steal an election and led to what was almost a violent blocking of a transfer of power. If that happened in the United States for electing an authoritarian president, certainly a similar crisis could occur in Brazil. So Brazilian democracy is not dead. Brazilian democracy is not dying. It has some real sources of strength. But under threat, yes, I would say so.
When you talk about the US, and that's something that we obviously looked at, the whole world was looking at that and at those scenes at that day. One of the elements that we heard with quite a lot of frequency was the fact that there was a fraud in the electoral system. At least that was the alleged argument used by Trump. Not by surprise, that's exactly the argument that is being used already 6 months for the election in Brazil, also regarding the procedural votes. Basically, the fact that you have questions about the vote, obviously questions that are put by the president himself, questioning the integrity of the vote. How can we take measures to protect the system in face of such a reality, in such almost a situation that you can predict that a question will be put if he loses the election, for example? What kind of measures could
first of all,
be?
several things. First of all, Brazil has a very good electoral system. It has a much, much better electoral system than we have in the United States. The American system is much, much more vulnerable to fraud and manipulation than the Brazilian one. So the fact that Congress blocked the changes to the electoral system, the end to the return to a paper ballot as Bolsonaro proposed, I think was one very positive move. The other thing that's important that Brazilians and particularly folks in the media like you are starting to do is raise awareness. It's much harder to steal an election or to overturn an election if there has been a big public discussion about it, if people know that it's coming and know to expect it. Elections are best stolen by surprise. And so the fact that the Brazilian civil society, Brazilian media, Brazilian opposition are ready for it, I think is important. The other measure that I think could be taken that hasn't been taken in Brazil, unfortunately, is my own view is that when you face an authoritarian threat like Trump or like Bolsonaro, it's very important to build a very broad coalition against that authoritarian. And if there's a chance that the president will try to create a crisis and say there's been fraud and try to cancel the election or overturn the election, it's the best way to avoid that is a huge victory against him, to beat him 60-40 in the first round. And that, of course, requires that the entire opposition, from the PT to the center right, unite in the first round, which is a big ask, and people will say it's politically impossible. But I think that's the best way to assure a landslide victory. The best way to avoid fraud is a landslide victory. The best way to assure a landslide victory is a single candidate and a victory in the first round. And unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Well, it is true. It does not seem it will happen. But it's very interesting how, for example, in Hungary, they took many years to realize that they needed also a single candidate, or at least a candidate that could um, bring together forces from different parties. Still, Orban last month won again the election. It seems that once in power, it is very difficult to get rid of them, especially but when basically the rules of the game keep changing, and obviously the situation is a different one when they are for such a long time in power. What kind of lessons Hungary teaches us in terms of this power grasp, basically?
Well, I want to make a distinction between Hungary and Brazil in a second, but one lesson that you point to, and I think you're right, is the more time these guys spend in power, the easier it is for them to consolidate power and to tilt the playing field against the opposition. And by Orban's been in power now for more than a decade. By 2021, 2022, he controlled really the entire media. He controlled the judiciary. He controlled the bulk of the private sector. And so there was a very, very uneven playing field. So the opposition did the right thing in uniting. But when you're fighting against, in a truly authoritarian regime like Hungary, Hungary is more like Venezuela than it is Brazil. The opposition is fighting an unfair fight. And when oppositions, even when oppositions do all the right thing in an authoritarian regime, they often lose. In Brazil, luckily, uh, the case is much more like the United States, where you have an authoritarian figure in power who can do great damage, but who has not yet been able to tilt the playing field. He doesn't control the bulk of the media. He doesn't control civil society, and has not weakened the opposition the same way that Orban has. So opposition unity will do much more good in Brazil than it did in Hungary.
What about the army? What role will the army, either in Brazil or in the US? Obviously, it was a different situation, but
The
what
army,
is the role of the army there?
the army is an absolutely critical player. You cannot pull off a presidential autogolpe, as we say in Spanish, self coup, without the cooperation at some level of the armed forces. This is why ultimately Trump failed, because the army was not going to lend itself to his adventures. Um, and in Brazil, it's a little more of an open question because the United States has a very, very long tradition of civilian control over the military. So Trump mobilizing the military was always going to be very, very difficult. With Bolsonaro, he has been aligned with the military, doing favors to the military, empowering the military, and different uh, armed groups for many, many years. And so the big question is, it's very curious that Bolsonaro constantly copies Trump, and he's even copied Trump in things that in where he failed, like Trump's COVID policy was a disaster. Bolsonaro seems to have copied it. Trump tries an autogolpe and fails and loses. He's out of power, and Bolsonaro seems to be following a similar playbook. If the Brazilian military refuses to cooperate with his adventures, I think Bolsonaro will also fail. But if he can somehow get the military to go along, he could have a different outcome. He could have more luck than Trump. So far, it looks like, in spite of everything, that the military command is unlikely to cooperate with Bolsonaro.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the case. Now, one thing that happened in the U.S. was that as soon as the first results came out in the ballots, you saw international leaders congratulating almost immediately Joe Biden for his victory. And we had even the situation here at the UN that Guterres, who should be quiet for a while until the election is absolutely assured, he also came out and basically congratulated Joe Biden. My question, what is the role of the international community in a case such as the ones that you know very well in Latin America or specifically in Brazil? Can the international community really play a role in basically pushing aside the possibility of an autogolpe?
It's a pretty minor role, especially in a big country like the United States or Brazil. In a smaller country like Honduras or Bolivia, it can make a bigger difference. But the international community, the international reaction is not as important. It's not as influential as it was back in, say, the 1990s. In the 1990s were the decade of global democracy. The Soviet Union had collapsed, communism had collapsed, and Western-style democracy, for better or worse, was the only game in town. And the United States and Western Europe were the dominant military, economic, political, cultural forces on Earth. And in those days, in the 1990s, international response was very important. Not so much in a country like Brazil because it's so big, but in many, many countries in Latin America. Today, it's the U.S. has much less influence. The liberal West has much less influence than it did 30 years ago because of the inevitable dispersion of power across the globe, the role of Russia, of China. So yeah, a strong, quick, decisive international reaction would be positive. It helps. I don't think it was decisive in the case of Trump and Biden, and I don't think it will be decisive in the case of Bolsonaro and Lula either in Brazil. But it helps.
Yeah. Now, basically, 2022 is obviously a very important year in our young democracy in Brazil. But my question is a little bit more broad. It's a bit broader than just Brazil. What is at stake in Latin America in 2022 if, let's say, a chaotic process happens in Brazil, and if we end up with a situation that a disputed election turns out to be the scenario? What is at stake for the region?
It's hard to say, but my guess is quite a bit is at stake. Again, Brazil is a very big, very influential country, and it's hard not to think back to 1964 when the coup in Brazil had a really powerful demonstration effect across the rest of the region. Brazil was in many respects the first of its type of what is now known as a bureaucratic authoritarian regime. And after the Brazilian coup and the success of the Brazilian coup and the success of the military in the early years, Brazil has a lot of influence, and much of the rest of the region, even long-standing democracies like Uruguay and Chile, followed suit. This is not to say that everything Brazil does gets copied, but what happens in Brazil matters much more in Latin America than what happens in, say, Nicaragua or Bolivia or Ecuador. This will be closely watched, and so I've been worried about this I worry about Brazil first and foremost, but I worry about the rest of Latin America because if Bolsonaro and his model were to succeed, he would become a model for the rest of the region. We've already seen little Bolsonaros emerge in places like Peru and Chile and elsewhere. But if Bolsonaro were really to succeed, he would become a model across the region, and that would be terrible for democracy.
Just one last question, and now not as a political scientist, but as someone watching Brazil from abroad, as I am as well. What is today the image of this country that was somehow a promise of a stable democracy or a stable power that could stabilize basically not only the region, but perhaps even other places on earth with emerging countries, etc. What is today the image Brazil projects abroad?
I'm not sure I can speak for all of abroad, but I think it is. I mean, Brazil has had a very rough period of almost a decade now. Of the last 7 or 8 or 9 years in Brazil have been very difficult. It's in a sense been a perfect storm, right? One of the worst economic crises in the country's history, combined with what might have been the biggest corruption scandal of any Western democracy in history, combined with a terrible problem of violent crime, gives rise to the election of a man that many Brazilians are not proud of. It's hard to, just like it was hard for an American to travel abroad and admit that they were American because our president was Donald Trump for 4 years. Many Brazilians feel that way too. Jair Bolsonaro is for many people abroad a pretty despicable figure, and so obviously Brazil, with all of its potential and all of its real economic and geopolitical power, is going through a very rough period, and its image is as a country that is in a downturn, that is sort of failing. But Brazil's been there before, and Brazil has a lot, like the United States, has a lot going for it too. Brazil is not Nicaragua. It's not Venezuela. Brazil has a strong civil society. It's got pretty strong state and other institutions. And I think much like the United States, there's this perception about Brazil that, yes, a lot is going wrong. A lot could go wrong, but the raw materials are there for things to go very right and for Brazil to do a number of good things, as it did in much of the early 21st century. So Brazil and the United States, for all of the crises that they are facing right now, are both have the potential to be two of the world's most interesting multiracial democracies. And I continue to be, I'm not sure that, I think I'm speaking for myself, not for abroad, but
Yes.
I have a lot of hope for Brazil.
Yeah, we, in a way, we thought democracy came in our birth certificate after the 90s. So it seems that there was a bit of a way of looking at things as if they were assured. Obviously, they were not assured. Obviously, many of these institutions showed, I would say, some resistance, some resilience, but obviously the threat is there. But as you said, 2022 will be very, very much a decisive year as well in Brazil. As
we are watching, we're all watching very closely.
I'm sure you are.
Those of us who care about democracy in Latin America are watching what's happening in Brazil this year very, very closely. We know it's very important.
Fantastic, Professor. I would like to thank you very, very much for taking your time to talk to us, to explain basically these challenges of democracy. Obviously, we'll count on you if things go well, and obviously if things don't go that well, to try to sort out a way out, basically, of this crisis. Professor, thank you once again for giving a little bit of your time.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to talk. Have a good night.
Thank you. Esse foi, então, o professor Levitsky, da Universidade de Harvard, autor do best-seller Como Morrem as Democracias, um livro absolutamente fundamental para entender um processo que não é só brasileiro, que não é só latino-americano, que de fato atinge várias partes do planeta, que é justamente a deterioração da democracia em várias partes do mundo. Muito obrigado aí pela audiência, certamente um programa bastante completo, pelo menos no que se refere às avaliações de Levitsky sobre a democracia brasileira, a comparação com os Estados Unidos e, claro, o ano de 2022, como ele mesmo coloca, um ano decisivo não só para o Brasil, mas também para a América Latina. Bom dia para todos e até a próxima sexta-feira aqui no canal MyNews.